The earth did not merely shake on the morning of February 23, 1945. It groaned under the rhythmic industrial weight of the Black Dragons. These were the 240mm howitzers, monstrous siege engines designed to pulverize mountain fortifications, now leveled at the heart of a living city. At 7:30 a.m., the air over Manila vanished, replaced by a vacuum of heat and pulverized limestone as 140 artillery pieces began a coordinated symphony of annihilation. Inside the walled city of Intramuros, the 400-year-old Spanish stones disintegrated into a fine, choking grey powder. These walls were 40 feet thick and had survived centuries of earthquakes and colonial shifts, yet they were no match for modern steel. For the thousands of civilians huddled in the damp darkness of San Agustin Church and the surrounding stone cellars, the world had become a claustrophobic tomb. They were caught in a lethal vice. Behind them, Japanese sailors and Marines, driven by a nihilistic no-surrender doctrine, had transformed every altar and courtyard into a sacrificial nest of machine guns. Before them, a wall of American shells was systematically erasing the historic soul of the Philippines. The sound was a Bessemer converter roar, a mechanical shriek that stripped away the dignity of the Pearl of the Orient. It left only the metallic tang of cordite and the smell of ancient dust. But to understand how this cultural jewel became a slaughterhouse, we must look back to a time before the fire. In 1935, the atmosphere at the Manila Hotel was defined by a country club confidence. It was a unique synthesis where Spanish grandees, American administrators, and the Filipino elite moved through air-conditioned splendor. General Douglas MacArthur and Major Dwight D. Eisenhower stood on the hotel's veranda in their crisp white drill suits and Panama hats. They looked out over the gracious mansions of Dewey Boulevard, seemingly detached from the strategic rot beneath the surface. While the socialites danced to boogie-woogie on the seawall, the American military mission was quietly grappling with a grim reality. The War Department in Washington had long viewed the Philippines not as a fortress, but as a liability. This was the core of War Plan Orange, a strategy that assumed the islands were a tactical outpost meant to be traded for time. MacArthur, fueled by a mixture of personal ego and a paternalistic love for the islands, rejected this pragmatism. He replaced the realistic assumption that the islands were indefensible with an ambitious, ill-supported commitment to a full defense. This plan was anchored by a fleet of B-17 heavy bombers that existed more on paper than on the tarmac. The illusion of security was maintained by romantic imagery. The American cavalry rode through the streets, while thousands of local ROTC students drilled in mock helmets at the foot of the Intramuros walls. But the facade shattered with clinical precision. On December 8, 1941, news of Pearl Harbor had reached Manila hours earlier, yet the Far Eastern Air Force remained tethered to the ground at Clark and Eber fields. When the Japanese bombers finally appeared, their silver wings glinting in the high noon sun, they found the American air power lined up like targets in a gallery. Within minutes, the strategical defensive was nothing more than a field of blackened, twisted aluminum. The psychological shock was absolute. Even as the wings of the few surviving bombers were grounded, society wedding guests in the city continued to shave and attend ceremonies. They were clinging to a normalcy that was already dead. As the Japanese veteran forces moved south like a strange, weird hymn, the defense at Lingayen Gulf collapsed in a chaos of uncoordinated counterattacks. MacArthur's transition from heroic defender to strategic retreat was reactive and desperate. By Christmas Eve, the Pearl of the Orient was declared an open city, but the transition was far from peaceful. The skyline was blotted out by the oily black plumes of the Pandacan oil depots, which the retreating Americans had set ablaze. The biting stench of burning timber and cordite filled the streets as looters scrambled through the ruins. In a surreal tableau of the coming doom, a Santa Claus in a red suit stoically piled sandbags in front of a toy store on the Escolta. Nearby, couples at the Manila Hotel performed a final haunting slow dance to a live band. When the Japanese finally entered on January 2, 1942, they found a harbor filled with the funnels of sunken ships. These were hollow tombstones marking the end of American Manila and the beginning of a 3-year descent into darkness. The silence that followed the fall of the Rock on May 6, 1942, was more deafening than the 2 million pounds of shells that had pulverized the concrete barracks of Corregidor. In Manila, The humid air sat heavy and stagnant as the Voice of Freedom radio broadcast flickered out. It was replaced by the rhythmic alien thrum of Japanese propaganda marches. For the Manileño, the psychological surrender was a physical weight. The Great White Father across the sea was gone. In his place stood the Imperial Japanese Army, an occupying force that arrived not merely to seize territory, but to re-engineer the Filipino soul. The Pearl of the Orient was no longer a colonial outpost. It was now the centerpiece of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a new order where Western materialism was to be purged by spiritual fire. The transition was signaled by the stinging crack of a hand against a face. Public life became a gauntlet of ritualized humiliation. At every street corner, Japanese sentries stood like statues of weathered bronze. They demanded a deep, waist-high bow from every passerby. To fail, to nod too shallowly, or to look a soldier in the eye, was to invite the slap. It was a sharp, sudden blow that left ears ringing and pride shattered. This was the Asian dignity promised by the occupiers, delivered at the end of a bayonet. Beneath the surface, the city's economy was being hollowed out with surgical ruthlessness. The Mickey, mouse money, brightly colored, unnumbered currency that felt like plaything paper, flooded the markets. It turned a sack of rice into a king's ransom. By 1943, the gracious Dewey Boulevard was no longer a promenade for socialites. It had become a graveyard for gas bags, which were charcoal-fueled makeshift boilers, strapped to the backs of pre-war Buicks and Chevrolets. The smell of the city shifted from the salt spray of the bay to the acrid biting stench of burning coconut husks. It was the pervasive, sour odor of a starving population. Yet the Japanese cultural warriors, a 1,000-man team of novelists, filmmakers, and clergymen, believed they could still win the spiritual war. They sought to film their masterpiece, The Dawn of Freedom, a propaganda epic designed to show the world the liberation of the Philippines. In late 1943, the production reached its climax on the streets of Manila. The Japanese directors had a cinematic vision. Filipino civilians were ordered to line the boulevards and jeer at a column of defeated American prisoners of war. It was meant to be a public display of the death of Western prestige. The sun beat down on the Escolta as thousands of Manileños, forced into the streets by the secret police, waited in a sullen, sweating mass. Then the column appeared. These were not the Hollywood soldiers of the 1930s. They were the ghosts of Bataan and Corregidor. They moved with the Aleutian stare, their eyes fixed on a point miles beyond the horizon. Their ribcages were visible through tattered, salt-stained khakis. The smell of them, dysentery, unwashed skin, and rotting tropical ulcers, hit the crowd before they even reached the cameras. The Japanese directors gave the signal for the jeering to begin. But as the crowd looked into the eyes of the starving men, the script began to fail. But the script disintegrated. Instead of the planned insults, a profound and electric silence gripped the Escolta. Then, a woman in the front row broke. She did not scream, but she wept. That sound triggered a tidal wave of defiance that no bayonet could suppress. Suddenly, the extras surged forward and broke through the Japanese security cordons. They were not attacking, but they were giving. Handfuls of cigars, crumpled Mickey Mouse bills, and precious hidden scraps of food were thrust into the hands of the staggering prisoners of war. Children ducked under the arms of guards to press pieces of fruit into the pockets of men they had been told to hate. The Japanese officers, panicked by this spontaneous eruption of solidarity, swung their rifle butts and shouted orders that went unheeded. There was only the sight of Filipino hands reaching out to touch the ragged sleeves of American soldiers. They treated them not as defeated colonizers, but as brothers in a shared and agonizing weight. The film was eventually finished, but the spiritual war was lost in that moment on the Escolta. The Pearl of the Orient had been bruised and starved. But beneath the enforced bows and the worthless paper money, the city had begun to harden into a single, silent fortress of resistance. They were waiting for a promise that was now written in the defiant tears of its people. By the summer of 1944, the new order in Manila had begun to smell like rot and charcoal. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, arrived to find a city that was less a strategic asset and more a sprawling, hungry liability. While the headquarters of Yamashita hummed with the pragmatic planning of a withdrawal to the northern mountains, a shadow command was coalescing in the humid darkness of the port area. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, viewed Manila through the prism of naval bushido. His career had been defined by the stinging loss of his battleship, the Kirishima. To Iwabuchi and his 16,000 naval troops, the city was not a place to be abandoned. It was a deck to be defended until it sank. This friction created a command paradox that would turn the Pearl of the Orient into a pressure cooker. As Manila transitioned into the central nerve center for the victory plan, the civilian population became an afterthought. They were caught in a high-stakes gamble between Japanese internal bureaucracy and the personal theater of Douglas MacArthur. In Brisbane and Hollandia, MacArthur was fighting a different kind of war. He was a military megastar, obsessed with the optics of his return. To the United States Navy and the Joint Chiefs, the Philippines were a strategic detour. The logical path to Tokyo ran through Formosa. But MacArthur understood the power of the "I shall return" brand. He manipulated media dispatches and leveraged his political weight to force a Philippine landing. He prioritized the symbolic liberation of a colonial capital over the tactical efficiency of a naval bypass. He needed Manila to be a ripe plum and a stage for a choreographed triumph. He did not see, or perhaps chose to ignore, the cost of his demands. By insisting the city be taken whole and fast, he was driving the Japanese toward a no-surrender doctrine. It was a path that ensured there would be no city left to liberate. The illusion of a peaceful transition shattered with clinical suddenness on the morning of September 21, 1944. Inside the wrought-iron gates of the Santo Tomas internment camp, a young boy named Robin Pricing sat through a tedious arithmetic lesson. The humid air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Then the sound arrived. It was a dull and indefinite humming that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. It was not the heavy rhythmic drone of Japanese bombers. It was sharper and more aggressive. Pricing looked up to see the sky filled with glistening silver-white specks. These were the Grumman Hellcats of Task Force 38, diving out of the sun. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted in a frantic and uncoordinated cat's cradle of black puffs, but the American pilots moved with a terrifying predator-like grace. From the rooftops, the prisoners watched as the silver wings banked over the harbor. The sound of the explosions at the Pandacan oil depots rolled across the city like heavy furniture being dragged across a floor. For the first time in 3 years, the rising sun flag felt fragile. But for the civilians outside the camp, the liberation from the air brought a new and intimate terror. The Japanese response to the raids was not military, but punitive. In the Tondo and Ermita districts, the military police descended like a plague. They were accompanied by the Makapili, a counter-guerrilla militia whose members were the stuff of nightmares. These men moved through the streets wearing baskets over their heads, with 2 jagged holes cut out for eyes. These secret eyes resembled figures from a Goya painting. A hooded figure would point a trembling finger at a father, a brother, or a student. Then the Japanese would drag them away into the silence of Fort Santiago. The city became a landscape of frontline squalor and paranoia. Families stopped going out. They lived in a state of foreboding, listening to the tinkling of tiles falling from roofs during the raids. They heard the shrill and sudden cries of neighbors being taken in the night. The Pearl of the Orient was being hollowed out. Its people were caught between the American love of 500-pound bombs and the Japanese hate of the hooded informers. As the American armada moved toward Lingayen Gulf, the final strategic blunder was being drafted by the Sixth Army. The American command decided to violate the ancient principle of the Golden Bridge. Sun Tzu taught that one must always leave an enemy a path for retreat. Instead, the Americans decided to surround Manila completely. By closing the door to the east and blocking the escape routes to the hills, they trapped a suicidal naval garrison inside a dense urban labyrinth. They were locked in with 250,000 civilians. It was a calculated decision to prioritize the speed of encirclement over the safety of the population. The trap was now set. The Japanese were no longer an occupying force. They were a cornered animal in a concrete cage, prepared to kill all, burn all, and destroy all. As the sun set over the bay, it cast a copper-burnished light over the smoldering skyline. The city waited for the flying columns of the 1st Cavalry to arrive. They were unaware that the liberation they had prayed for was about to become a fantasia of death. It was a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The race for Manila was not dictated by logistics or geography. It was driven by the volatile chemistry of 3 powerful egos. General Douglas MacArthur sat in his command post, obsessed with the optics of a triumphal entry. To ensure the fastest possible result, he weaponized the professional rivalry between General Walter Kruger and General Robert Eichelberger. He dangled the prize of the capital before them like a lure. This sparked a reckless and high-speed dash that prioritized publicity over the security of the flanks. By February 1, 1945, this strategy had birthed a mechanized monster. The 1st Cavalry Division was ordered to cover 100 miles of enemy territory in 66 hours. They moved like a strange and weird hymn through the darkness of central Luzon. They bypassed Japanese strongpoints and left the infantry to mop up the rear. Everything was sacrificed to reach the city limits before the headlines could cool. The climax of this frantic surge arrived at 8:30 p.m. on February 3, 1945, at the wrought iron gates of the Santo Tomas internment camp. Inside, nearly 4,000 internees, men, women, and children who had spent 3 years shrinking into hollow ghosts, huddled in a darkness thick with the smell of wood smoke and the sweet, sickly odor of the starving. Suddenly, the night was shattered by the rhythmic, industrial clatter of iron treads. A massive searchlight cut through the humid air, its blue-white glare illuminating the lead tank, battling basic as it gathered speed. The sound was a mechanical shriek of grinding steel as the tank's nose hit the main gate. The iron groaned, buckled, and then snapped, the heavy gates swinging inward like paper. As the American soldiers spilled out of the tanks, the air was filled with the sharp, metallic tang of gasoline and the heavy thud of combat boots on the gravel. The scene was a surreal collision of two worlds. Emaciated prisoners, their rib cages visible through tattered shirts, staggered into the light, blinking against the brightness. One elderly woman reached out with a trembling hand to touch the rough wool of a soldier's sleeve, her voice a dry whisper, asking if he was real. The soldier, his face smeared with grease and the dust of the 100-mile dash, gave the laconic, grounding reply that he reckoned he was. For a few hours, the Pearl of the Orient felt like a miracle. General Douglas MacArthur, fueled by the euphoria of the rescue, moved with a mask of command that bordered on the delusional. He looked at the smoldering skyline and the liberated camp and declared Manila a ripe plum that had already fallen. He signaled his staff to begin planning a victory parade that would feature 4 ruffles and 4 flourishes and pristine spit and polish uniforms. But the ripe plum was a rotting trap. While the 1st Cavalry celebrated at Santo Tomas, the American paratroopers pushing up from the south hit a wall of fire that the flying column strategy had never accounted for. This was the Genko Line, a sophisticated, lethal defensive belt that stretched across the southern approaches to the city. Here, the Japanese had repurposed 5-inch and 6-inch naval guns from sunken warships, embedding them in earthquake-proof concrete pillboxes that defied standard light weaponry. The paratroopers, accustomed to the expectations of a rapid liberation, found themselves pinned down in the elephant grass near Nichols Field, caught in a cat's cradle of interlocking machine gun fire and heavy mortar bursts. The environment was a nightmare of impressive improvisation. The Japanese were not retreating, they were burrowing into the very fabric of the city, using aerial bombs with nose-impact fuses as improvised landmines. The psychological breaking point arrived on February 9, 1945. The American infantry, tasked with clearing the dense urban districts of the North Bank, suffered its most catastrophic day of the campaign. 19 men were dead, and 216 were wounded in a matter of hours. The humanitarian restraint that MacArthur had initially demanded, the prohibition on using heavy artillery in a friendly city, shattered under the weight of the mounting body bags. The American commanders, looking at the frontline squalor of their bleeding units, realized that the city's thick stone walls were serving as both sanctuary and tomb for the enemy. To save American lives, the doctrine shifted with clinical finality. The order went out to blast and clear. The lavish use of massed unobserved artillery became the new language of the liberation. The air over Manila vanished, replaced by a vacuum of heat as 105mm to 240mm howitzers began a coordinated symphony of annihilation. This was no longer a rescue, it was an industrial-scale demolition. The Black Dragons, the monstrous 240mm siege engines, leveled their sights on the historic administrative buildings, turning the legislative and finance centers into hollowed-out shells. The Pearl of the Orient was being systematically erased by the very steel sent to save it, as the American command accepted the chilling necessity of destroying the town to rescue its people. The ripe plum had turned into a furnace of fire and ash, and the true battle for Manila, a house-to-house, room-to-room slaughter, was only just beginning. The city did not die a clean death. It was subjected to a double-death paradox, caught in a lethal pincer between the systematic, ritualized Japanese hate of the kill-all doctrine and the indiscriminate heavy-metal American love of saturation bombardment. By mid-February, the city's cosmopolitan soul was being methodically liquidated. At the German Club, once a bastion of European neutrality, the atmosphere curdled into a nightmare of fire and steel. 500 souls, including women and children who had sought refuge behind the perceived shield of the swastika flag, found themselves trapped as Japanese Marines turned the building into a funeral pyre. The air inside the club became a thick, suffocating soup of heat and the metallic tang of blood as the occupiers began a clinical extermination. They bayoneted infants and tossed grenades into clusters of pleading mothers. Outside, the American shells pounded the roof, collapsing the burning timbers onto the dying. The neutrality of the Red Cross was similarly erased. This was the descent into nihilism, where the dream of a greater East Asia expired in a frenzy of gasoline and cold steel. Now, we return to the dust and the thunder of February 23rd, as the walls of Intramuros finally give way under the weight of the 240mm shells. The Black Dragons had finished their work, leaving a jagged 200-foot breach in the ancient Spanish stone that looked like a raw, bleeding wound in the city's history. As the red smoke signals drifted lazily over the ruins, the American infantry rose from the rubble and rushed the gaps. They expected a climactic cinematic struggle. Instead, they were met by a silence that was more terrifying than the barrage. The soldiers moved through the choking grey powder of pulverized limestone, their boots crunching on a carpet of worthless occupation money and shattered capiche shell windows. Inside the San Agustin Church and the dark, damp dungeons of Fort Santiago, the liberators found the true cost of the saved city. They discovered the bodies of hundreds of men and women executed in the final hours. The corpses were piled 5 deep in the stone cellars, their hands bound with wire, their faces frozen in the hollow stare of those who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. The hell on earth was not the fire that still flickered in the rafters, but the realization that the Manila they had come to rescue had been replaced by a hollowed-out charnel house. The soldiers, hardened by a month of urban slaughter, stood in the ruins of the Manila Hotel penthouse, looking at the shattered shards of MacArthur's fine vases and the charred remains of an old car. They realized then that the pearl had been crushed into a fine, unrecognizable grit. The end of the battle was a jarring and surreal piece of theatre. On February 27, 1945, the stench of 100,000 dead still hung over the smouldering ruins of the city. General Douglas MacArthur staged his triumphal return to the Malacanang Palace. The ceremony was a study in spit-and-polish choreography. The military megastar stood in a pristine uniform, demanding 4 ruffles and 4 flourishes from the buglers. Just blocks away, families were still digging through the blackened debris for the remains of their children. As MacArthur's voice broke during his proclamation, silver wings glinted in the sky above. The Far Eastern Air Force put on a massive display over a landscape of front-line squalor and blackened chimneys. The city was officially liberated, but it was a victory of erasure. The American infantry and the cavalry had fulfilled their mission, but they had inherited a graveyard. As the sun set over the ruins of the legislative building, the survivors of the double death stood in silence. They were not listening to the cheers of victory. They heard only the dull, indefinite humming of a city that had been shattered beyond repair. The pearl of the Orient had been saved only by its total annihilation. The silence that descended upon Manila on March 3, 1945, was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. As the last Japanese resistance in the finance building was snuffed out, the city existed only as a cartographic memory. The air was once scented with the salt spray of the bay and the sweet aroma of roasting coffee. Now it was a thick, grey soup of pulverized limestone, charred timber, and the sickly rot of 100,000 unburied bodies. For every one American soldier who fell in that month-long inferno, 100 Filipino civilians were sacrificed. They were caught in a double death of Japanese bayonets and American high explosives. Survivors moved through the ruins with a hollow stare, stepping over drifts of worthless occupation money that swirled in the heat shimmer of the blackened streets. This was the victory promised on the chocolate bar wrappers of 1944. It was a liberation that required the total erasure of the people it was meant to save. The transition from the battlefield to the courtroom was a clinical attempt to impose order on a landscape of chaos. In October 1945, the high-ceilinged ballroom of a surviving residence was converted into a theater of victor's justice. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, sat in the dock with a face of weary defeat. The prosecution built their case on a legal simplification called the Yamashita Standard. This doctrine held him personally accountable for the systematic atrocities committed by 16,000 naval troops. These were men who had openly defied Yamashita's orders to evacuate the city. But as the testimonies of survivors filled the room, the legal technicalities of command chains felt increasingly irrelevant. They heard tales of the massacre at the German club and the bayoneting of infants at the Red Cross. Yamashita had spent the battle hundreds of miles away in the mountains, unable to communicate with the rogue naval garrison. Still, he was sentenced to hang. His execution took place on February 23, 1946. It was exactly 1 year after the American artillery had breached the walls of the old city. For the American military, this was a way to package the horror of Manila into a single, manageable villain. By hanging the Tiger, the American command could turn the page on their own strategic failures. They could bury the reality of their saturation bombardment beneath the soil of a heroic liberation myth. This hidden history was further obscured by a deliberate post-war campaign of silence. While the world mourned the destruction of Warsaw and the siege of Stalingrad, the annihilation of Manila was quietly edited out of the official narrative. The American military was eager to transition the Philippines from a colonial ward to a Cold War ally. They censored the most visceral images of the urban slaughter. The country club atmosphere of the pre-war era was replaced by a strategic amnesia. The monuments and the textbooks of the 1950s focused on the Great Return and the flag-raising ceremonies. They omitted the frontline squalor of the hospitals, where American shells had fallen on the very people they intended to rescue. The tragedy of Manila became a localized trauma, held in the scarred hearts of the survivors, but largely ignored by a global public. Yet, amidst this psychological scarring, a final and paradoxical act of human grace emerged from the ruins. In July 1953, President Elpidio Quirino sat in his office. He was a man who carried the physical and emotional weight of the battle more than perhaps any other. He had watched his wife and 3 of his children torn apart by Japanese machine gun fire at a street intersection. He had lived through the absolute erasure of his family's world. Now, he held the pardon papers for the remaining Japanese war criminals being held in prison. The political pressure to maintain a posture of eternal hatred was immense. But Quirino looked beyond the mask of command and the thirst for vengeance. He recognized that for Manila to truly rise from the ash, the cycle of hate had to be broken by a civilized act of mercy. He signed the pardon. It was a spiritual reconciliation that stood as a testament to a city that refused to be defined solely by its destruction. It was a quiet conclusion to a conflict of industrial-scale slaughter. As the pardoned soldiers were sent home, the Pearl of the Orient remained a landscape of blackened chimneys and hollowed-out stone. It remains a hidden tragedy of global significance that whispers a final, somber truth. In the pursuit of a symbolic victory, the cost of the return was nothing less than the soul of the city itself. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.